You'll manage. You always do." Those were the last words my son said before I heard the deadbolt turn. The sound was soft, almost polite. Not a slam, not a shout, just a quiet, final click that echoed louder than any scream ever could. I stood there in my own living room, 68 years old, barefoot on the rug I bought 20 years ago, listening to his car engine fade down Maple Ridge Drive. I remember staring at the door as if it might apologize and open itself again. It didn't. He had taken my house key from my purse earlier that morning, said he needed to check the locks. I thought he was being thoughtful, protective. That's what mothers do. We translate cruelty into care because it hurts less that way. But when I tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. And that's when I understood. He hadn't just left. He had locked me in. No phone. He'd insisted on upgrading mine the week before and taken the old one with him. No landline. Those went out of fashion years ago. My pantry was nearly empty because he and his wife had promised to bring groceries after their trip. A quick vacation, he'd called it. Florida sunshine, ocean views. "Mom, you don't need much. You hardly eat anyway," he'd said with a tight little smile. "You'll be fine for a few days." I walked slowly to the kitchen and opened the cupboard. Half a sleeve of crackers, 1 can of green beans, no bread, no milk. The refrigerator hummed back at me, nearly bare. The house felt different now. Smaller, not cozy the way it had for decades. It felt sealed. I lowered myself into my rocking chair by the window, the one Harold bought me the year our son turned 5. My hands rested in my lap, but they wouldn't stay still. They trembled like leaves in October. How does a mother get here? How does the little boy who once cried because I left him at kindergarten become the man who locks the door behind her? I closed my eyes and saw him at 6 years old, running toward me after school, backpack bouncing against his shoulders. "Mama," he used to yell, as if I were the safest place in the world. And for a long time I was. I gave him everything. My time, my strength, my second chances. I worked double shifts at the roadside diner in Dayton, Ohio, refilling coffee cups until my feet swelled in my shoes. I skipped dinners so he could have seconds. I turned down a proposal once. Yes, a real one, because I didn't want him to feel replaced. I never thought I was investing in a retirement plan. I thought I was raising a son. The sun shifted in the afternoon sky, slanting through the curtains his wife once criticized for being outdated. I hadn't changed them. I liked them. They were yellow, cheerful. Funny how the house still looked like love, even if it didn't feel like it anymore. My stomach tightened not just from hunger, but from something deeper. A slow realization creeping in. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was deliberate. He had called me dramatic last week when I refused to sign something he brought over. "Just paperwork," he said. When I asked questions, his jaw tightened the way his father's used to. "You don't trust me?" he'd asked. I did. That was my mistake. Outside, the neighborhood went quiet as evening approached. Porch lights flickered on. Somewhere down the street, children laughed, and that's when I let myself cry, not loudly, not wildly. Just quiet tears sliding into the lines time had already carved on my face. But here's the thing about age. When you've lived long enough, fear doesn't last forever. After the tears came something else. Clarity. Because while my son believed he had left me helpless, there was one thing in this house he had forgotten. And by morning, he would realize just how badly he had miscalculated. Hunger has a way of sharpening memory. That first night alone, I didn't sleep much. The house creaked the way old houses do, settling into the cool Ohio air, and every sound reminded me that I was the only heartbeat inside these walls. My stomach grumbled loud enough to embarrass me, even though there was no one there to hear it. I chewed half a cracker slowly, letting it soften on my tongue, and found myself drifting back, not to the cruelty of last week, but to the boy who once clung to my apron strings. My son's name is Daniel. He was born during a thunderstorm in August of 1987. The hospital lights flickered that night, and I remember holding him against my chest, whispering that no matter how loud the world got, I would always be his calm. I meant it. His father left when Daniel was 9, not with a dramatic goodbye, not even with a fight. He simply said he needed space and packed 2 suitcases before dinner. I stood at the kitchen sink that evening, washing dishes that didn't need washing, and told myself I wouldn't let my son feel abandoned. So I became 2 parents. I took extra shifts at Miller's Diner off Route 35. I learned how to fix leaky faucets by watching library DVDs. I stitched up Halloween costumes by hand when we couldn't afford store-bought ones. When Daniel wanted to join Little League, I sold my mother's pearl necklace to cover the fees. He never knew. I didn't want him to. There's something fierce about a mother raising a boy alone. You convince yourself that if you just love him enough, feed him enough, encourage him enough, sacrifice enough, he'll grow into a man who understands what that love cost. Daniel was bright, quieter than other boys, but thoughtful. He'd sit at the kitchen table doing homework while I counted tip money in the evenings. Sometimes he'd look up and say, "One day I'm gonna buy you a big house, Mom." I'd laugh. I don't need a big house. I just need you. Maybe that was my mistake. When he got into Ohio State, I thought my heart might burst with pride. I took out a second mortgage to help with tuition. The loan officer asked if I was sure. "I'm sure," I said, because what is a mother supposed to say? During his college years, he called every Sunday, told me about classes, professors, dreams of starting his own construction business. I kept every postcard he sent, every voicemail. When he graduated, he hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. "I couldn't have done this without you," he whispered. I believed him. For a while, life felt like a reward. He got hired by a respected firm in Columbus, bought tailored suits, started speaking with a confidence that made me proud, even if it sounded unfamiliar sometimes. The first time I noticed something shifting was subtle. He invited me to dinner with some of his colleagues. I wore my best navy dress, the one I saved for church, and halfway through the meal, he leaned over and said softly, "Mom, you don't have to tell the waitress you work in a diner. It sounds small. That word stayed with me. I laughed it off that night, but something inside me tightened. Then he met her, Vanessa. Perfect hair, perfect posture, perfect smile that never quite reached her eyes. She didn't insult me outright. That would have been easier to confront. Instead, she corrected my grammar gently, suggested I modernize my living room, asked Daniel, right in front of me, if he'd considered upgrading environments. I didn't understand what that meant at first, until one evening, about 6 months after their wedding, Daniel sat across from me at this very kitchen table, the same one where he once did multiplication worksheets, and slid a manila envelope toward me. "Mom," he said carefully, "have you ever thought about putting the house in my name? Just in case something happens." Something happens. I remember staring at that envelope longer than I should have, because deep down, I knew that wasn't about safety. It was about ownership. And that was the first night I locked my bedroom door. Not because I feared strangers, but because I began, quietly, to fear my own son. And sitting there now, alone in a house he had sealed from the outside, I realized that envelope had not been a request. It had been the beginning of a plan. And I had just become the obstacle standing in its way. There's a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from realizing you're no longer seen. The morning after Daniel slid that envelope across my kitchen table, I made coffee like always. Same chipped mug, same quiet sunrise through the yellow curtains Vanessa hated. But something inside me had shifted. I hadn't opened the envelope that night. I knew what it contained. The weight of it had been enough. When I finally did open it the next afternoon, my hands were steady. Inside were neatly printed documents, property transfer forms, highlighted in bright pink tabs. My name typed where a signature would go, his name waiting beside it. Just precautionary, he had said. Precautionary against what? Old age, death, or independence. I folded the papers carefully and placed them back into the envelope. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove myself downtown to speak with an attorney. His name was Mr. Halbrook. White hair, kind eyes, and a way of listening without interrupting. I told him I didn't understand the language in the documents. He adjusted his glasses and read quietly for a long moment. "This isn't precautionary," he said finally. My stomach tightened. "It transfers full ownership to your son immediately. You would no longer legally own this home." The room felt smaller. "But I could still live here?" I asked softly. He hesitated. "Only as long as he allows it." I drove home slowly that day, slower than I ever had. The world outside the windshield looked the same: grocery stores, gas stations, children waiting for buses. But I felt as if I'd stepped into a different version of my life. That evening, Daniel called. "So," he asked casually, "did you sign it?" "No," I replied. Silence. Not confusion, not concern, just silence. "Why not?" "I wanted to understand it first." "You don't trust me." His voice sharpened the same way it had when he was a teenager caught in a lie. "It's not about trust," I said gently. "It's about my home." There was a pause long enough for me to hear Vanessa whisper something in the background. Then his tone changed, calmer, colder. "Mom, this is just how things are done. It makes financial planning easier. Vanessa's parents already structured their property this way." Vanessa's parents. Somehow, they had become the standard. "I'm not Vanessa's parents," I said quietly. That's when he exhaled in that impatient way I had begun to recognize. "You're being stubborn." Stubborn. The word stung more than it should have. I had been many things in my life, tired, broke, determined, but never stubborn. After that conversation, the visits changed. They became shorter, tighter. Vanessa began looking around my house not as a guest, but as a surveyor, measuring spaces with her eyes, commenting on how dated everything felt. "You'd be so much happier somewhere maintenance-free," she said one afternoon, tracing her manicured finger along my bookshelf. "I like maintenance," I replied with a smile. She didn't. Daniel stopped hugging me when he arrived, stopped asking about my week. Instead, he'd sit at the table and talk about market values, property appreciation, untapped equity. Once, when he thought I was out of earshot, I heard Vanessa say softly, "The lot alone is worth more than she realizes." She, not Mom, not Margaret, just she. That was the first night I checked the locks twice, not because I thought they would break in, but because I realized they were already trying to push me out. And then came the afternoon Daniel raised his voice in my kitchen for the first time in his adult life. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, hands flat against the counter. "For who?" I asked. "For all of us, all of us." But I wasn't included in that circle anymore. That night, after they left, I walked down to the basement, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to think. Needed quiet. There are things in a house that children forget about. Old storage bins, locked filing cabinets, emergency kits from long winters, things a careful woman keeps. And as I stood down there in the cool cement silence, I realized something else. If Daniel believed I was weak, if he believed I had no plan, then perhaps it was time I let him keep believing that. Because sometimes the safest place to stand is exactly where they think you'll fall. There's a moment when a request turns into a demand. You don't notice it at first. It happens quietly, like frost forming on a window. But one day you touch the glass and realize it's no longer clear. That's how it was with Daniel. After I refused to sign those papers, he didn't argue right away. Not directly. Instead, he changed tactics. He began visiting less often, but when he did, It was never just to see me. It was always attached to something. A quick question, a small favor, a temporary solution. One Sunday afternoon, he came alone. That should have comforted me. It didn't. He didn't sit, didn't take off his coat. He just stood in the living room, hands in his pockets, glancing around like he was evaluating square footage. "Vanessa and I met with a financial advisor," he said. "Oh." I folded the dish towel in my hands and waited. "He thinks it would be smart to consolidate assets. Make things cleaner, as if I were clutter." "And how does that involve me?" I asked. He sighed the way men sigh when they believe they're speaking to someone unreasonable. "Mom, you're not getting younger." The words weren't shouted. They were spoken calmly, logically. That's what made them hurt. "I'm aware," I said lightly. "If something happens to you suddenly, probate could take months. The house could get tied up. It just makes sense to transfer it now, while everything's simple." Simple. I looked at my son, my child, and saw not the boy who once asked me to check under his bed for monsters, but a man calculating risk. "Daniel," I said slowly, "are you worried about me or about paperwork?" His jaw tightened. "You're twisting this." "No," I replied gently. "I'm trying to understand it." He walked to the window, stared at the yard where he used to kick a soccer ball against the fence. "You know," he said without turning around, "Vanessa thinks you'd be happier somewhere smaller. Somewhere with people your age. People my age." I felt something heavy settle in my chest. "Is that what you think?" I asked. He hesitated. "That's not the point." It was exactly the point. Weeks passed, and the tone shifted further. He stopped framing it as advice, stopped pretending it was optional. One evening, I overheard him on the phone in my driveway. He didn't know I was behind the screen door. "Yeah, we're working on it," he said. "She's resistant, but she'll come around. The equity alone makes it worth it." Equity, not home, not memories, not mother. Equity. I stepped back inside quietly, but my hands trembled so badly I had to grip the kitchen counter. That night, I pulled out a small notebook from the drawer beside my bed. I hadn't written in it in years. It used to hold grocery lists and birthday reminders. That night, I began writing something else. Dates, conversations, exact words. Not because I wanted to fight, but because something inside me whispered that I might need proof one day, not of his greed, but of my clarity. A week later, the conversation turned uglier. He came over with Vanessa this time. She didn't sit either. "We found a beautiful senior living community outside Springfield," she said brightly. "Gardens, activities, on-site nurses. It would be perfect." "For who?" I asked quietly. "For you," Daniel answered quickly. "And honestly, it would free us up too. We're stretched thin, stretched thin." I hadn't asked them for anything in years. "I'm not moving," I said. Vanessa's smile flickered. "You can't maintain this place forever." "I've maintained it for 40 years. Daniel's patience snapped then. I saw it happen. The polite mask fell away. "You're being selfish," he said. "Selfish." After everything, my ears rang. I raised you alone, I said softly. I worked holidays. I skipped vacations. I never asked for anything in return. No one asked you to, he shot back. The words landed like ice water down my spine. No one asked you to. He said it casually, as if it were obvious, as if love were a loan I issued without permission. Silence filled the room, thick, heavy. Vanessa stepped closer to him, almost protectively. We're just trying to make smart decisions, she said coolly. And that was when I understood something important. They weren't asking anymore. They were preparing for a future where I was a problem to be solved. And that night, when Daniel left without saying goodbye, I walked down to the basement again. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed to check something. Because there was a small metal box down there, one Daniel had never noticed, and inside it was the one thing he would never expect his dramatic mother to have already arranged. Some betrayals arrive loudly. Others come in whispers you were never meant to hear. 3 days after Daniel called me selfish, I found out about the vacation. Not from him, from Mrs. Hargrove across the street. "Oh, Margaret," she said cheerfully, while we stood by our mailboxes. "I hope you enjoy the quiet while Daniel's in Florida." Vanessa posted the cutest picture of them at the airport, Florida. I smiled politely, nodded, pretended I knew. But my stomach tightened the way it does before a storm. When I got back inside, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at my phone. He hadn't mentioned a trip. Not a word. No, we'll be gone a few days. No, call if you need anything. Nothing. I told myself I was overthinking it until he showed up that evening. He didn't knock the way he used to. He used his key. I had given it to him years ago for emergencies. "Mom," he called out casually as he stepped inside, car keys jangling. "You home?" I stepped into the hallway. "You're going to Florida?" I asked before he could speak. He paused, surprised. "Who told you?" "So it's true," he exhaled, annoyed. "Yeah, just for a week. Vanessa's cousin has a beach house. It was last minute. And you weren't going to tell me," he shrugged. "It's not a big deal." It was to me. Because for the first time in my life, I felt unnecessary. "I assumed you'd be fine," he added quickly. "You're independent." Independent. The word sounded kind. It didn't feel kind. "I have a doctor's appointment Friday," I said quietly. "The cardiologist." He glanced at his watch. "You can Uber." "I don't use Uber." "Mom," he said sharply, "you can't expect us to revolve around you every time you have something minor." Minor. He didn't ask what the appointment was about. He didn't ask if I was nervous. He just walked past me into the kitchen. Vanessa entered behind him, heels clicking against my tile floor. "We came to grab a few things we left in the basement," she said lightly, "and to check the breaker panel, just in case. Just in case." They moved through the house with a confidence that didn't feel like love. It felt like inspection. I watched as Daniel opened the pantry. "Do you have enough food?" he asked casually. though I noticed he didn't wait for my answer before closing the door again. "I'll manage," I said. He smiled faintly. "I know you will." They didn't stay long, but before leaving, Daniel did something that made my chest tighten. He walked to the front door, stepped outside, and then turned the deadbolt from the exterior with his spare key. I noticed because I heard it. That small, deliberate click. He turned back toward me. "It's for safety," he said. "We've had break-ins around here." "For whose safety?" I asked. "Yours." Vanessa smiled at him approvingly. "We just don't want anything happening while we're gone." I stared at the lock. "That key only works from the outside," I said carefully. Daniel's expression hardened for half a second. "You still have your key." "Do I?" I reached into my purse. Empty. My spare key had been on the kitchen hook for years. It wasn't there anymore. "I must have moved it," I said slowly. "Probably," he replied quickly. "You misplace things sometimes." I felt something shift in my spine. Not fear, not yet, just awareness. Vanessa stepped closer to him. "Ready?" she asked brightly. "Yeah." He leaned down and kissed the top of my head, the way he used to when he was young and leaving for school. "We'll be back before you know it." And then he left. The door shut. The car engine started, and I stood in the quiet house, staring at the deadbolt. I walked to the door and tried the handle. Locked from the outside. My key was gone. My spare was gone. The grocery shelves were nearly empty, and the son who once cried when I left him for 10 minutes had just sealed me inside for 7 days. But as I turned slowly toward the hallway, I didn't panic. Because Daniel had made one mistake. He thought I had never noticed what he was becoming. He thought I had never prepared. And down in the basement, inside that small metal box he never bothered to open, was the reason I didn't reach for the door again. By morning, he would learn exactly what I had done. There is a difference between being alone and being contained. That first night after Daniel left for Florida, the house felt sealed tight, like a jar, with the lid screwed on too firmly. Every window suddenly looked smaller, every wall closer. I stood by the front door for a long time, fingers resting against the cool brass handle, as if it might change its mind. It didn't. The porch light outside clicked on automatically at dusk, glowing through the frosted glass, like a reminder that the world was still moving, just not for me. I checked every window. Locked, not by me, by him, not broken, not damaged, just secured in a way that required a key I no longer had. I felt foolish for not noticing sooner, but when your child tells you something is for your safety, you don't immediately search for traps. You search for reasons to believe him. The pantry held less than I remembered. I opened cabinets twice, as if something might magically appear the second time. Half a sleeve of crackers, 1 can of green beans, peanut butter nearly empty. He had looked inside earlier. He knew. I sat at the kitchen table and folded my hands to keep them from shaking. "Margaret," I told myself, "breathe. Panic wastes energy." and energy was something I could not afford to waste. The house ticked with cooling pipes. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. Life was continuing, but I was paused. I walked slowly down the hallway to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. My heart thudded heavier than usual, not from fear alone, but from something deeper. Humiliation. Not because I was locked in, but because he believed I would simply accept it, that I would wait quietly, that I would be grateful for his protection. I lay back and stared at the ceiling fan turning in lazy circles. My mind drifted to a memory I hadn't visited in years. Daniel at 12 years old, insisting he could stay home alone while I worked a late shift. He had puffed out his chest and said, "I'm not a baby, Mom." I remember smiling and locking the door from the outside back then too, just for one evening, but leaving him the key on the hook beside the stove, because trust goes both ways. That night, he had waited up for me, proud and responsible. Now the roles were reversed, except he hadn't left me the key. Around midnight, my chest tightened, not dangerously, just enough to remind me of Friday's cardiology appointment, the one he called minor. I sat up slowly and placed my feet on the floor. I could not afford to spiral, because unlike what Daniel believed, I had not been passive these past months. I had been watching, listening, preparing. 3 months ago, after the envelope and the pressure, and the way Vanessa began referring to my home as the property, I made a quiet decision. I didn't confront them. I didn't argue. I simply arranged, and part of that arrangement was tucked inside a small metal box in the basement, behind the old Christmas decorations and the broken lamp Daniel promised to fix 10 years ago. He had never bothered to go past the first row of storage bins. Why would he? To him, the basement was clutter. To me, it was strategy. I stood slowly, wrapped my cardigan tighter around my shoulders, and walked toward the basement door. Each step down creaked under my weight, but I wasn't afraid of the dark. I had lived through darker things than this. At the bottom of the stairs, the air felt cooler. Still, the metal box sat exactly where I left it, unmoved, untouched. I knelt carefully and lifted the lid. Inside were documents, copies, a notarized letter, and something else, something time-sensitive. I ran my fingers over the envelope marked with tomorrow's date, because Daniel believed he had isolated me. He believed silence meant helplessness. But he had forgotten one thing about his mother. I may be older, I may move slower, but I am not foolish, and by this time tomorrow, while he is sipping something sweet on a Florida beach, he will receive a message that will drain the color from his face. Because the lock he turned tonight was not the only thing that clicked into place. There is something steadying about having a plan. While Daniel was likely watching the sunset over the Gulf of Mexico, I was sitting cross-legged on my basement floor, the metal box open in front of me, feeling calmer than I had in months, Fear had burned off sometime after midnight. What replaced it wasn't anger. It was certainty. Inside the box were three things. The first was a notarized statement I had recorded 2 months ago. After Daniel first suggested, I was confused about paperwork. In it, I described in clear, steady language every conversation about the house, every push, every suggestion that I relocate for my own good. The second was a copy of a revised estate plan, one that did not leave my home to Daniel. And the third was the most important. An envelope labeled in my own handwriting. If I don't answer by 10 o'clock a.m., 10 o'clock was an ordinary time. Not dramatic, not suspicious, just late enough in the morning that I would reasonably have answered a phone call. 3 months ago, I walked next door and handed a spare phone, one Daniel didn't know existed, to my neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove. Inside that phone was a scheduled message set to send automatically if I didn't manually cancel it each morning by 10. The message would go to 3 people: Mrs. Hargrove, Mr. Halbrook, my attorney, and the county non-emergency police line. It wasn't dramatic. It simply stated, I am being kept in my home against my will. Please conduct a welfare check immediately. I set it up after Daniel joked, half joking, about how easy it would be to handle things if I were already moved somewhere secure. Secure. That word again. I never told him about the phone. Never told him that while he was measuring my future in equity and resale value, I was measuring risk. That morning, I climbed back upstairs slowly, conserving energy. I drank a small glass of water, ate 2 crackers, sat by the window. The house was quiet, but I wasn't panicked. I didn't try the door again. There was no need. At 9:45 a.m., I folded my hands in my lap and waited, not for rescue, for consequence. I did not cancel the message. At exactly 10 o'clock a.m., the scheduled alert sent itself. I imagined Daniel laughing at breakfast somewhere beachfront, Vanessa adjusting her sunglasses, the world warm and careless around them. And then I imagined his phone buzzing. He wouldn't recognize the number at first, probably assume it was spam. But he would read the message. He would see the words, welfare check in progress. Because once Mrs. Hargrove received the alert, she had strict instructions: call the police and state clearly that her elderly neighbor had not responded to a prearranged safety confirmation. And Mrs. Hargrove is not a woman who ignores instructions. By 10:20, I heard it. Not a knock. Not yet, but tires slowing outside my house. Doors opening. Measured footsteps on my porch. And then 3 firm knocks against the front door. Ma'am, police department. We're here for a welfare check. The sound traveled through the wood like oxygen. I stood slowly and walked toward the door. I'm inside, I called out, keeping my voice steady. And I can't unlock it. There was a pause on the other side. Can you explain why, ma'am? Yes, I said. My son locked it from the outside before leaving for Florida. Silence. then quieter voices conferring. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I simply waited. Because somewhere, miles away on a bright shoreline, Daniel's vacation had just ended, and for the first time since he turned that lock, I was no longer the one contained. He was. There is something almost poetic about the way panic moves. It travels faster than airplanes, faster than excuses, faster than denial. The police didn't break the door down right away. They tried calling Daniel first. Procedure, they said later. I imagine his phone buzzing against a beach towel. 1 missed call. 2, 3. Then a voicemail. Mr. Carter, this is Officer Ramirez with the Clark County Sheriff's Department. We are conducting a welfare check at your mother's residence. Please contact us immediately. I wasn't there to see his face when he heard it, but I know my son. His first reaction would not have been fear for me. It would have been fear for himself. On my porch, the officers knocked again. Ma'am, are you in immediate danger? No, I answered truthfully, but I was locked in without food and without a key. There was a pause. Locked in by who? My son. The words felt strange leaving my mouth. Not dramatic, not hysterical, just factual. That's what changes everything. When emotion turns into documentation. Mrs. Hargrove had already shuffled across the lawn in her slippers, cardigan wrapped tight around her shoulders. She stood behind the officers like a quiet witness. I received the message exactly at 10, she told them. She and I have an agreement. An agreement. I was proud of that word. It meant I had not been reckless. I had been prepared. At 10:42 a.m., one of the officers' radios crackled. Subject has returned the call. States he is out of state. Claims mother may be confused. Confused. I almost laughed. He says she sometimes forgets things, the officer added gently, as if testing my reaction. I do forget things, I replied calmly. But I don't forget when someone takes my keys. That was when the officers made a decision. One of them walked around the perimeter of the house. The other stayed near the door, speaking into his radio again. By 11:05 a.m., a locksmith was on the way. I imagined Daniel's next call wasn't to me. It was probably to Vanessa. And that call would not have been calm, because once authorities are involved, the story stops being private. It becomes record. When the locksmith arrived, he worked quickly, professional, quiet. The deadbolt was removed. The door finally opened inward with a soft push. Sunlight spilled across my living room floor. Fresh air followed. I stepped outside slowly, not dramatically, not as a victim, but as a homeowner exiting her own property. Mrs. Hargrove squeezed my hand. Are you all right, Margaret? Yes, I said. I am now. One of the officers asked if I wanted to file a formal report. I thought carefully. I would like it documented, I replied, for everyone's protection. Documented. That word matters, because documentation does not scream. It does not exaggerate. It simply exists. Around noon, Daniel called my neighbor's phone. I could hear his raised voice even from where I stood. What do you mean they opened it? She's fine. She probably just misplaced her key. He still believed this was about forgetfulness. He still believed he controlled the narrative, but control shifts quietly, just like locks do. By the time he realized the officers had physically entered the home, by the time he understood there was now a report number attached to his name, the sun in Florida probably didn't feel so warm anymore, because panic does something sunlight cannot. It exposes. And while he was rushing to book the first flight home, I was sitting on my own porch, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, drinking water from Mrs. Hargrove's thermos. Free. Hungry, yes. Shaken, maybe. But free. And Daniel was finally learning something I had understood for months. You can lock a door, but you cannot lock consequences. And when he stepped off that plane, he would not be walking back into control. He would be walking into record. There's a sound a mother never forgets. Her child crying. But there's another sound that changes everything. Her child panicking. Daniel was back within 24 hours. I knew before he even knocked. The tires screeched just slightly as his car pulled into the driveway too fast. The engine shut off in a hurry. A car door slammed. Panic travels fast, but guilt drives faster. I was sitting at the kitchen table when he burst through the front door, this time with a locksmith's fresh key in his hand, not control. "Mom," he called, breathless. "What is going on? Why are the police involved?" I looked up slowly. He looked smaller somehow, disheveled, sunburned from Florida. The crisp confidence he usually wore like a tailored suit was gone. "What do you mean, what's going on?" I asked calmly. "You locked me inside my house." His jaw flexed. "That's not what happened." "Oh, I locked the door for safety, you know that. And removed my keys." He hesitated. "You misplace things." There it was again. Confused, forgetful, fragile. I folded my hands on the table so he wouldn't see them tremble, not from fear, but from the finality settling inside me. "The police have documented the situation," I said. "There's a report number." His face changed at that. "Why would you do that?" he snapped. "Do you realize how that looks? How that looks. Not how that felt. Not how that endangered me. Just how that looked." "You were unreachable," I said. "I had no key, no groceries, no way to leave." "You always exaggerate," he shot back. "It was a week. You would have been fine." Fine. I stared at him, this man who once clung to my leg when I left him at preschool. "A week without food?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer. Because now, standing in my kitchen, with documentation on file and neighbors aware, the story was no longer private. It had witnesses. Vanessa arrived 10 minutes later. She didn't hug me. She didn't ask if I was all right. She walked in, scanning the room, assessing damage like she was calculating fallout. "This is blown completely out of proportion," she said sharply. "Do you know what kind of trouble this could cause?" "Yes," I replied softly. "I do." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "You could have called me." "I did not have a phone." You're being dramatic. No, I said gently. I was being cautious. The silence between us stretched thin, and then something shifted. He realized. The police report meant leverage. The documented welfare check meant record. The recorded call logs meant proof, and somewhere in that realization, his anger faltered. Mom, his voice changed, softer, careful. You know I would never hurt you. I searched his face for the boy I raised. I didn't find him. You didn't have to hurt me, I said. You just had to decide I was inconvenient. That landed. He exhaled slowly. We were trying to help you. By locking me inside, Vanessa stepped forward. We were protecting you. From what? I asked. She didn't answer, because there had never been danger outside, only ambition inside. Daniel sank into the chair across from me, elbows on his knees. You've made this bigger than it needed to be. No, I said calmly. I finally made it visible. That's when he understood something he hadn't expected. I wasn't crying. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't begging. I was steady. And steady is harder to manipulate than fragile. The house, he said cautiously, testing the ground. We can still talk about the house later. Let's just fix this first. There it was. Not apology, not remorse, logistics. I stood slowly. The house is not the issue anymore. He looked up. Then what is? I held his gaze. Trust. The word hung heavy in the air. Trust once broken doesn't shatter loudly. It cracks quietly and spreads. You embarrassed me, he muttered finally. I nodded. And you endangered me. His mouth opened to argue, then closed, because for once, he didn't have a counter. Vanessa tugged his sleeve gently. We should go, she whispered. He stood, but he didn't meet my eyes. Are you pressing charges? He asked quietly. I asked for documentation, I said. The rest depends on what happens next. That uncertainty unsettled him more than anger ever could. Consequences are heavier when they aren't yet defined. As they walked toward the door, he paused. Mom, I didn't think you'd actually do something like this. I smiled faintly. That's because you stopped seeing me as someone capable. The door closed behind them. This time, from the inside. And as their car pulled away, I didn't feel victorious. I felt awake, because something had changed permanently, not just in him, in me. And I knew the hardest conversation was still ahead, the one about what comes after betrayal. Because survival is one thing, but what you choose next, that's where dignity lives. There is a strange silence that follows a storm, not the kind that feels empty, the kind that feels earned. 3 months passed after Daniel came back from Florida in a panic. 3 months of paperwork, statements, and uncomfortable conversations. The police report remained on file. No dramatic arrests. No courtroom spectacle. Just documentation, calm, permanent, real. That was enough. Daniel's company placed him under review. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to bruise his pride. Vanessa stopped posting pictures online. They stopped talking about renovations, stopped mentioning senior facilities. They stopped assuming, and I stopped waiting. I changed the locks myself, paid a local handyman in cash, installed a small camera at the front porch, bought my own groceries, more than I needed, just because I could. Independence tastes different when it isn't forced. It tastes earned. Daniel didn't visit for weeks after that day. No calls either. Pride can starve a relationship faster than neglect ever could. Then one afternoon in early autumn, as the leaves turned the same yellow as my curtains, he showed up alone. He didn't use a key. He knocked. I opened the door slowly. He looked tired, not defeated, just altered, the kind of tired that comes when your image of yourself cracks. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped aside. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he once did homework, where he once asked for seconds, where he once promised to buy me a big house someday. "I shouldn't have locked the door," he said quietly. It wasn't dramatic. No tears, no performance, just a statement. "No," I agreed. "You shouldn't have." He swallowed. "I didn't think it would turn into this." "That's because you didn't think at all," I said gently. He stared at his hands. "I thought I was helping. Vanessa kept saying you needed structure, protection." "And what did you think?" I asked. He hesitated. "I thought it would be easier." Easier. That word again. It is amazing how often harm hides behind convenience. "I'm not a problem to solve," I said calmly. "I'm your mother." His eyes finally lifted. "I know." There was a time when those two words would have healed everything. "Not anymore." "I don't want your house," he said suddenly. "I don't care about that." I held his gaze. "I don't believe that," I replied gently. "Not yet. The truth isn't cruel. It's just clear." Silence settled between us. But this time it wasn't sharp. It was honest. "I don't know how we got here," he admitted. I did, but I didn't say it to wound him. "We got here one small dismissal at a time," I said softly. "One ignored feeling. One you're overreacting. One decision made without me." He nodded slowly. "I was wrong. There it was. Not perfect, not polished, but real." I reached for my tea, letting the warmth settle in my palms. "I'm not pressing charges," I told him. "I never wanted revenge." His shoulders relaxed slightly. "But," I continued, "things will not go back to how they were." He stiffened. "What does that mean?" "It means I keep my house, my finances, my independence. It means you knock before entering. It means if you ever treat me like I am incapable again, that door closes permanently." I let the words sit. "Love doesn't mean ownership," I said quietly, "and it doesn't mean obedience." He didn't argue. That was new. We talked for another hour. Not about property, not about money, just about life. Work, regret, small, ordinary things. When he stood to leave, he paused at the door. "I didn't realize you'd actually stand up to me," he said softly. I smiled faintly. "I didn't either." After he left, I locked the door from the inside. The house felt different now. Not smaller, not sealed, just mine. I walked to the living room and sat in my rocking chair by the window. the late afternoon sun stretching across the floorboards. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who believed sacrifice was the same as love, the one who gave until there was nothing left. And I thought about the woman I am now, still loving, still a mother, but no longer willing to disappear for someone else's comfort. At 68, I learned something I wish I had understood decades ago. Children are not investments. Sacrifice is not currency, and dignity is not negotiable. If love remains, it must stand beside respect, not beneath it. The house is quiet tonight, but it isn't lonely. It is peaceful. And for the first time in a long time, so am I. Thank you for being here and listening. If this story touched you, please tap the like button. It helps more than you know. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. And if you feel comfortable, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from or sharing a small part of your own story.